So welcome, Judd. I consider that we're extremely lucky to have somebody of the caliber of Judd Brewer in our field as a colleague and thought leader and friend. And my sense of Judd is that he's really engaging in cutting-edge science, but he has a gift for making it extraordinarily accessible and fun and engaging. He's just published a book, The Craving Mind, and I think this is the title of his talk today. So, Judd Brewer, thank you very much for being with us.
Great, thank you. Well, it's a great honor to be here, and I thought we could just jump right in. What we can start with, and I know that I'm standing between you and lunch, so my job is to try to capture your attention for a little while. So maybe we could start with why Facebook is like crack cocaine, why McDonald's has been so successful, how Lolo Jones could have won the Olympic gold medal, and maybe how we can hack our own reward-based learning. So that's a tall order for 45 minutes. What I thought we could start with, this is a picture from the royal wedding earlier this year. And my question for you is, who is missing out? So this is a video, we've all probably seen versions of this in our own lives. This is a woman looking at her cell phone. Yep. So at Yale University, where they reportedly have pretty smart students, in New Haven, Connecticut, they had to paint on the crosswalk to look up. And I don't think it's because the students are getting dumber, but their phones are certainly getting a bit smarter. So we can explore this today and really ask ourselves, how does this process get set up? And I'll start with a personal story. So I was in France for the first time a couple of years ago. In 2014, I did some sightseeing with my wife. We went to the Louvre. And in 2014, it was a banner year for a number of things. But in particular, Time magazine named this device, these two women are holding, as one of their top 25 inventions of the year. Yeah, to me, it's a sign of the apocalypse. But we can use this as an illustrative story. So we can imagine we're at the Louvre with our good friend, and our brain says, this is wonderful, let's capture this moment so we can hold on to it. So we pull out our phone, we take a selfie, and then our brain says, no, I have a better idea. Let's post this on Facebook. So how do we spend the rest of our time at the Louvre? Looking at the artwork, or checking to see how many likes we got? Of course, I have to point out that the French, they do everything in style. Vive la France! So what's going on here? Our brain, so there's a study at Harvard University a couple of years ago where they put people in an fMRI scanner. And the way we do fMRI studies is we take two comparison conditions. So one of the options was to earn money, another was to basically talk about yourself. And so they compared these two things. Guess what people chose to do? And as they were self-disclosing, they were activating a part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. Now, this is an important brain structure because it's a downstream recipient of dopamine from the ventral tegmental area, part of this reward processing system, that gets activated with every single known drug of abuse: alcohol, cocaine, heroin, cigarettes, and apparently Facebook. And in fact, there was another study that was done here in Europe where they found that they could predict the amount of time people spent on Facebook based on how much their nucleus accumbens was activated. So there seems to be something rewarding about talking about ourselves. There was a study that was done recently at UCLA where they put adolescents in an fMRI scanner. They took their own Instagram feeds, and the only manipulation they made was to toggle the number of likes that certain pictures got so they could determine what the effect of likes were on the brain. And what they found was the nucleus accumbens was activated, but they were also co-activating a brain region called the posterior cingulate cortex, which is involved in self-reference. And we'll talk more about this in a minute. But this study was really important because it shows this direct link between reward and self-referential processing. So here's my summary slide so far. But it's interesting. people are now studying this. They call this Facebook addiction disorder. And we can imagine, we're at the Louvre, our brain learns, oh, posting on Facebook feels good. And then we go back home from vacation and we think, wow, I'm not feeling so good. And our brain says, I have a great idea. Let's go on Facebook to feel better. And of course, we go on Facebook and we see everybody else on vacation, and it makes things worse. And so you can see with this path analysis that this actually leads to negative outcomes. In fact, there's a linear correlation between the adjusted odds ratio of becoming depressed and using social media. You can see this on the far end of the scale here. So how does this process get set up? This is where it gets even more interesting. It turns out that before paper was even invented, let's say the Buddha or the ancient Buddhist psychologists came up with this scheme that was reported that this is what the Buddha was contemplating on the night of his enlightenment, as in, this is probably worth paying attention to. It's called dependent origination. I'll give a simplified version here, but basically this cue comes into our mind. It gets evaluated as pleasant or unpleasant. Our brain says, ooh, pleasant, let's hold on to this. I want this to continue, so we have an urge for the pleasant things to continue. The unpleasant stuff, we say, get this out of here. We have this aversion or we have this craving to make this go away, and we behave accordingly. They describe this as leading to the birth of a self-identity, which then feeds back on the brain, or on the mind. They actually, we're a little brain-centric in modern day, but they actually didn't really have a clear sense of what was going on. I don't think we have a clear sense of what's going on yet, but let's just say I'm a little brain-centric in the way I'm presenting this. So a couple of interesting pieces here. One, this loop that they were talking about. They describe this using the term samsara, which literally means endless wandering. Or at least that's my understanding. I'm not a Pali scholar. So endless wandering, because we can imagine if we learn this stuff, we go on Facebook or we eat cupcakes when we're sad or we smoke cigarettes or whatever, we're not actually fixing the core root of the problem. We're just feeding it. The other thing that they pointed out was that they said this process is perpetuated through ignorance. And you're thinking, why is he using glasses here? Because in modern day, we call that subjective bias. We become biased based on our previous experiences, and they color how we see the world. So we start to see the world through, oh, if I'm sad, I should eat chocolate glasses, or, oh, if I'm stressed, I should smoke a cigarette glasses, or I should go on Facebook. And they really highlighted and emphasized this sense of self. As the more we do these things, the more we become identified with them, and we think, oh, this is me, this is me. I like this quote from Alan Watts, the philosopher. He says, ego, the self which is believed into self to be, is nothing but a pattern of habits. So now I'm going to show you a 1-minute Weight Watchers commercial.
If you're happy and you know it, then your face will surely show. If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad, eat what's your snack. If you're not really bad, if you're sad, eat a snack. If you're poor and you know it, if you're lonely and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sleepy and you know it, if you're guilty and you know it, if you're stressed, eat a snack. If you're human and you know it, then your face will surely show it. If you're human, eat your feelings, eat a snack.
Boom. I love that. If you're human, eat your feelings, eat a snack. So I had not seen this, and I'm guessing many of you have not seen this commercial. A friend sent this to me. She found it on YouTube, and I was talking to somebody at Weight Watchers Corporate, and I said, this is amazing. You've really nailed this learning process. Why don't we see this? And she said, oh, it makes people depressed. But what they're pointing out, and what the ancient Buddhist psychologists are pointing out, and what the modern day psychologists are pointing out, is this process, whether we call it dependent origination or we call it operant conditioning, is positive and negative reinforcement. This has a lot of evidence behind it. Whether it was Ed Thorndike, who described this back in the 1800s, B.F. Skinner, who became famous for it in the 50s with his Skinner box, or even Eric Kandel, who got the Nobel Prize in 2000, showing that this is evolutionarily conserved all the way back to the sea slug. The point here is that this is a very, very well-known process. And from a mechanistic perspective, this is really helpful because if I want to understand how something works so I can affect it, I want to understand the mechanism. And also as a clinician, so as an addiction psychiatrist, I want to know how this works so I can help my patients. So for example, with my patients with alcohol use disorder, there's this saying, people, places, and things. If you avoid people, places, and things, you're less likely to drink. To which my patients say, duh. But we can look mechanistically and see how that fits with this pathway. With other addictions like smoking, it's a little harder to avoid our front porch, our car, outside of work, and all the myriad places that we smoke. So there are other treatments like substitute behavior. So if you eat candy instead of smoking, you're less likely to smoke. The problem with these is that neither of these actually dismantle this core addictive loop. You can see with these orange arrows, they kind of treat around it. Now, here's where we can turn back to the ancient Buddhist psychology and ask, well, what's the problem here? And they say, here's one of the teachings that says, just as a tree, though cut down, can grow again and again if its roots are undamaged and strong, in the same way, if the roots of craving are not wholly uprooted, sorrows will come again and again. So they were really highlighting craving as part of as the core part of the problem. I like this modern day interpretation a little bit, but we get the idea. Now, if we want to look at the core elements to really see what are the necessary and sufficient components here, it really breaks down to three things: a trigger, a behavior, and a reward. And this process was actually set up evolutionarily so we remember where food is. It's to set up context-dependent memory. So we're hungry, we forage around, we find some food, our body sends a signal up to our brain, spritzes some dopamine in there and says, remember what you ate and where you found it. And so we feel a little bit better. So this is an essential learning process that kind of gets co-opted in modern day. For example, if we understand how the mechanism works, we can use it in various ways. I like this, and if you haven't read this New York Times expose, it's worth reading. The Doritos, so my favorite peer-reviewed journal, The Onion, they had a headline that said, Doritos celebrates its 1 millionth ingredient, right? Because this is not food. This is a manufactured object to addict us. And it's the perfect color, taste, smell, crunch, et cetera, to get us to eat more. There's a reason that I think it's Lay's potato chips that say you can't just eat one because we engineered it that way, right? That's the parentheses. So here's my summary slide of this part. So this is good and sometimes not so good news in terms of understanding mechanisms because that knowledge is very, very powerful. And this is also where we can start to step in and say, okay, mechanistically, we're starting to understand how the mind works, how our minds learn. What can we do? And so this is where mindfulness comes in. So from a mechanistic perspective, if we look at the mechanism here, there's this, in MBSR and other mindfulness-based trainings, we talk about this wedge of awareness. We bring this, instead of avoiding or substituting things, we bring this wedge of awareness in so that we can see what cravings feel like, we can see what all of this feels like, and then have that space to respond rather than habitually react. At least that's the theory. But because there's a mechanism here, we can actually test this. And so I don't think I need to give you a formal definition of mindfulness, but this is one that John Kabat-Zinn has put forward a long time ago. We can think about this in terms of that mechanism of push and pull. When we're pulled to hold on to pleasant things or we're pushing unpleasant things away, we can think of this as this balance that comes in when we're just bringing this awareness and even curiosity to the situation. But it might seem strange that doing that will actually help us change hardcore behavior. So it was a good question for us, and we had done a pilot study back when I was in residency training, actually, with alcohol and cocaine use disorders, and found that they were as good as cognitive behavioral therapy with preventing relapse to use. So then we started asking, can we use this as a primary therapy? And we basically developed a program for smoking cessation, randomized people to come in, didn't tell them what they were getting, and the folks that were randomized to the mindfulness group, on the first session, we said, go ahead and smoke, and they looked at us like, is this the experiment? Because they had all come in trying to quit smoking. On average, they tried to quit 5 to 6 times before. But we said, well, there's a twist here. Pay attention as you smoke that cigarette. And there's something remarkable that comes with paying attention. This is an example of what people notice. This person said, it smells like stinky cheese and tastes like chemicals, yuck. Now, this is a critical piece, and I had a guy, I remember, he'd smoked, I think, 40 years, and he was looking, and he was like, how did I not notice this before? And on average, I calculated this. If you smoke one pack of cigarettes a day for 40 years, that is about close to 300,000 times that you're repeating, that you're reinforcing that habit loop. And this guy had become so habituated that he didn't even notice it. But what this points out is this is not about forcing ourselves not to do something. That generally relies on the prefrontal cortex, which ironically goes offline when we're stressed out, which is often when we pick up a cigarette or a cupcake. But in fact, it starts to hack into this very reward-based learning system. So when we get stressed out and we smoke, but we pay attention when we smoke, our brain starts to say, is this really that good? There's a part of our brain called the orbitofrontal cortex that actually stores reward value, and it says, wow, this isn't as rewarding as I thought. So we become less excited to smoke in the future. Or in the ancient teachings, they talk about this in terms of becoming disenchanted with our behavior simply by bringing awareness to it. Or as the modern day sage Yogi Berra put it, you can observe a lot just by watching. Now, I won't go into all the details of our first study because we published it a little while ago, but the bottom line here is that we get 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment. And this is compared to cognitive therapy. So we were pretty surprised by this, and happily so. And so we started digging into mechanism, asking what's going on. Our hypothesis was, and we were just following up on the ancient psychology, was that mindfulness would work by decoupling craving and behavior. And there are a lot of analogies of craving with fire in the ancient teachings, and that the downstream of the craving is the clinging or even sustenance or fuel that actually fuels that next round of smoking. And so we can think of craving as a fire, and if we stop adding fuel to that fire doesn't magically go out, but it burns down over time as that residual fuel is consumed. And we can actually test that mathematically. So I promise this will be my only math slide. Strong correlation between craving and smoking at baseline, replicating a lot of other studies. This makes sense, but this correlation is completely abolished by the end of treatment. And when we look at moderators of the effect, it has nothing to do with craving, but it has everything to do with informal mindfulness practices. And these were actually stronger than the formal mindfulness practices that they'd learned, which was surprising to us. Formal practices were correlated, but they didn't work as predictors or as moderators of the effects. So that was really interesting. As people are bringing mindfulness to the act, they're starting to work to decouple that. But we can do a lot of things with statistics, and so I like to look at raw data, and you can see at the end of treatment, the folks that quit smoking and the folks that didn't quit smoking had the same amount of craving. But over time, as they stopped fueling that craving, you can see in the red line here, their cravings dropped, whereas the folks that kept smoking a little bit, their cravings continued. So that was some direct evidence suggesting that when we go back to the mechanism, that in fact mindfulness is helping to drive this wedge of awareness in between this urge to act and the action itself, and potentially even decoupling this longer term. So at the time we were doing these studies, this was when the iPhones and then the smartphones were becoming more popular. And it was interesting. I would look at my patients in the parking lot, and they'd have a cigarette in one hand, and guess what they had in their other hand, right? Their weapon of mass distraction. So we started thinking, my patient doesn't learn to smoke in my office. So what if I actually, this is context-dependent memory. What if I brought my office to them? And so we started playing with delivering this stuff through their own smartphones. And we got 3 app-based trainings that we're studying and developing now, one for smoking, one for eating, and even one for anxiety. Now you might ask, anxiety, habit loop, really? And it turns out there's a lot of good evidence around this. Borkovich's been a pioneer in this field, showing that there's a lot of negative reinforcement, where there's this unpleasant emotion, we start worrying so we can feel like we're in control or we can avoid the situation. But as our brain starts to become wise to that worry thinking, it's like, wow, that's not actually that rewarding. And the problem is that the worry then starts spiraling onto itself, and they go over this event horizon into the black hole, where the worry thinking triggers itself, and then it just goes back and forth and back and forth. And we can even see this in our patients. Some of the folks in our program, they describe this. This person said, I think of my to-do list or projects and conversations. I feel as though somehow the anxiety is trying to offer some control. So you might ask, how can you actually give people mindfulness training through an app? And we were asking the same thing, which is, could this actually work? Well, there's some interesting advantages to mobile technology. One is that you can take manualized treatments and you can cut them into bite-sized pieces. So you can give people daily training as compared to coming in, they were coming into my clinic once a week or sometimes twice a week. We can also have these modules be ones where they're like, oh, I don't have time to do this. Well, you have 10 minutes to sit on the toilet, right? Okay. What are you might have your phone with you anyway. You might as well do something productive. I'll show you an example of how we can provide animations to keep this stuff engaging. And importantly, from a clinical and a research standpoint, we can embed experience sampling so we can actually test, track and test efficacy, and they can actually track their own progress. So here, I'll show you an example of how this works. We actually worked with two animators who had both quit smoking using mindfulness themselves, so they were really jazzed about this project.
Today we're going to explain cravings through the metaphor of a screaming child. I know you've heard and seen a child throwing a tantrum. Perhaps for some of you, it was your own child. This child is screaming because he wants something, and you as the parent want him to stop screaming. All your child wants is a lollipop. So in this metaphor, think of your cravings as a child's tantrum. The lollipop is like the cigarettes. But what should you do? Yell at the child? That might make things worse. Gag the child? That won't stop the screaming in the short term. It will happen as soon as you take the gag away. You could just give him a lollipop. Congratulations! You just taught your child to scream for lollipops. In other words, you just taught him that screaming is a good way to get what he wants. What might you do instead? Here's a novel concept. Just let him scream himself out. What? Have you ever seen a child scream forever? Sometimes they scream so hard and so long that you think their head or your head. But not with us. What happens instead? Eventually, the child gets tired and stops.
So at the time that so you can get a sense for, we can teach these concepts which aren't necessarily easy, but are relatively simple through animations and things like that. So at the time we were developing this program, some of our pilot testers were reporting that they were actually changing their eating behavior. Now, it's really interesting and well known that on average, people that quit smoking, on average, they'll gain 15 pounds as they're trying to generally substitute eating for smoking. But what some of our folks were reporting was actually the opposite. They said they were actually cutting down on their snacking. And that's where I started to learn about how this process was set up to help us remember where food is, and it gets co-opted. And so I'll give you a brief vignette of a patient I saw in my clinic. This is a woman that was referred to me. She had full-blown binge eating disorder. She was about 30 years of age and at a very unhealthy weight when she came to see me. And what she described was that at around the age of 8, her mom had started emotionally abusing her, and that she found comfort in food. And by the time she came to see me, she was eating entire large pizzas in one sitting, 20 out of 30 days a month. And in fact, sometimes she would do this twice a day because she'd feel guilty about her binge, and that would trigger another binge cycle. But we could see clearly how this had been set up from a very early age. Now, we can see also how this fits into the mechanism. We feel this negative emotion, we binge eat, and as a lot of my patients have described this temporary relief comes in the form of numbing themselves from their emotions through that process. So we developed this program for emotional eating which is called Eat Right Now. But the idea is very similar to these other ones where, short trainings, they have an online community that they can connect with peers and get support. And even some of this was developed with kind of participatorily with my patients, where they were describing that they couldn't actually differentiate actual hunger or homeostatic hunger from hedonic hunger, emotional hunger. And so we even were developing things to help them start to become aware of this versus this, which is basically mindfulness. So I'll just cut to the chase because we're at early stages of testing this, but a study led by my collaborator Ashley Mason at UCSF did a feasibility study, and we were looking specifically at mechanisms. She found a 40% reduction in craving-related eating using experience sampling with this program. Now, this was really great to see because we're starting to see the same mechanism, the decoupling of craving and behavior both in smoking and in eating, which suggests that we might be headed down the right track. But even more importantly than this, I look to the folks in the programs to see if they're actually describing this in their own terms. So here's an example from somebody's journal. Somebody was keeping this on the online community. She said, "I understand why I go to food, to avoid or cover up or distract from uncomfortable feelings such as anger, sadness, or restlessness. Who wants to feel those? Trigger, uncomfortable feeling. Behavior, eat something that temporarily diminishes the feeling. Reward, still have to deal with the unpleasant feelings plus the sugar headache. I can clearly see how I got caught in this habit loop trying to escape difficult feelings with food, but that ultimately it doesn't work." So not only was she describing being able to map out how her mind works, but she was starting to become disenchanted. Oh, this isn't as good as I thought. Or here's another one, I love this. Simply put, dear sneaky habit loop that says eating junk food is fun, I'm onto you. So this was really promising for us. I'll just give you some preliminary data as we're just starting to test this anxiety program. In folks with moderate to severe generalized anxiety, we're starting to see a pretty significant drop. This is a very small pilot study. We look at GAD, the Generalized Anxiety Disorder 7. It's a clinically validated measure. These GAD-7 scores are dropping significantly. But as a clinician, I've also been observing that my compatriots, and this is not just physicians, but I think many healthcare workers are really facing an epidemic of burnout. So in a study led by one of my research assistants, actually, Alexandra Roy, we asked this question: can we actually see if physicians will actually use an app-based mindfulness training? Because many of them were telling us, I don't have time to take an MBSR course. So we recruited 50 physicians from the UMass system just to say, will you try this out? We used a couple of anxiety screening questionnaires. We didn't have to screen for burnout, unfortunately. And we were just looking at engagement and whether their anxiety would reduce and whether we could actually see a reduction in their Maslow burnout inventory as well. So we're still in the middle of this study, but we have some 1-month pilot data. And this is, I just want to highlight how important this is. So at baseline, 60% of these folks had moderate to severe anxiety. Half of these folks said that at least a few times a week they felt burnt out from their work. A quarter of them said they felt this way every day. Imagine going to your physician, 1 in 4 chance in the US, or at least at UMass, you're going to have a physician that feels burnt out. A third of them said they felt at least a few times a week they'd become more callous toward people since they took their job. So just to show you some data, we were collecting data at 1 month and 3 months, so we have our 1-month data back. We're already starting to see a significant reduction in anxiety, in burnout, and callousness. So this is really encouraging to see that this digital delivery of mindfulness can actually have real-world effects. So I just want to shift gears now. So we've been talking about behavioral mechanisms and kind of meeting them with digital therapeutics for behavior change. But I'd like to talk a little bit now about neural mechanisms. And I'll start this with a story. So this is Lolo Jones. She's an American athlete. She's actually a 3-time Olympian. Back in 2008, she was favored to win the hurdles, the 100-meter hurdles. This was back in Beijing. She'd made it all the way to the finals. She was in the finals, in the lead, at the 9th of 10 hurdles. And I'll just read you a quote that she gave to Time magazine when they interviewed her afterwards. She said, I I was just in an amazing rhythm. And then I knew at one point I was winning the race. It wasn't like, oh, I'm winning the Olympic gold medal. It just seemed like another race. And then there was a point after that where I was telling myself to make sure my legs were snapping out. So I overtried. That's when I hit the hurdle. So I think this is a very illustrative story around one of the misconceptions of mindfulness, which is, oh, I'm just going to rid my mind of my thoughts and then I will be okay. What she pointed out was that she had plenty of thoughts, you know, and then when she got caught up in her thoughts, that's when she literally tripped herself up. Or as one teacher put it, she got in her own way. So how often do we get caught up? There's a continuum, and there have been nice studies showing that about 50% of waking life we're daydreaming. If we get caught up in daydreaming, you know, and somebody says, hey, are you paying attention? We snap out of it. So that caught upness is not that strong or not that sticky. With stress, when we get caught up in stress and our ears start migrating, our shoulders start migrating to our ears, right? Wouldn't it be great if somebody said, hey, snap out of it? And we're like, oh, thank you. Why don't you stick with me all day, you know? So when we're caught up in stress, it's a little harder to let go or to drop out of that. And addiction being on the far end of the spectrum, I like the simple definition, continued use despite adverse consequences, right? We're so caught up that even when we're aware of it, we have no control, absolutely no control. And we can actually do this experiment and see what that caught upness feels like. And there was actually a study done, I think it was in Finland, where they took Western Europeans and they took folks from Asia and they induced a bunch of emotions. And we can actually, let's do this experiment for 15 seconds together. So remember a time recently when you were either afraid or anxious, okay? And if you can recall that, once you've recalled that, see where you feel that emotion the most, whether it's fear or anxiety in your body. Okay, and once you've done that, take a mental finger and point to where you feel it. And this is basically what this study was they developed these heat maps where people were reporting where they felt these emotions the most. So let's see if you've replicated their study. So with fear, do you feel it here? For those of you that recall the fearful experience, or anxiety, did you feel it here? Because they share a lot of these core, this core caught upness. And we know what it feels like. Oh, it's contracted, which makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. If there's some big proverbial saber-toothed tiger or whatever chasing us, our job is to make ourselves as small as possible and protect our vital organs. So we're gonna literally physically contract. Well, we know what that feels like. We all know what that feels like. Now, it's interesting from a brain perspective, getting caught up, for example, in daydreaming, because it happens so often, this can now be mapped neurally. And this is not a new finding, but in the field, this is actually one of the most reproducible findings now, that when we're not doing anything in particular, we're activating the self-referential brain network. Why? Well, what do we tend to do when we're not doing anything in particular? Who are we thinking about, right? So the point here, and you can see this is a busy slide, but the key here is there are two main hubs of the default mode network shown here in yellow. One is the medial prefrontal cortex, and one is the posterior cingulate cortex. And just to remind you, the posterior cingulate's that brain region that gets activated in adolescence when they are seeing their own Instagram feeds, when they're getting caught up in, oh wow, look at those likes. And in fact, I think it's Instagram figured out that they could gather a bunch of likes, and instead of just delivering them when you get them, you could jack the dopamine system even more if they brought them all together and you're like, oh, I didn't get any likes, and then suddenly 50 likes. Whoa. Well, guess what? That's not 50 people simultaneously liking your post. It's Instagram saying, how can we get you more addicted to our app? So, knowledge is very powerful. So let's dive more into the posterior cingulate cortex. It's been shown to be activated when people who are addicted to cocaine are shown pictures of people viewing people smoking crack cocaine. It lights up like a Christmas tree when people who are addicted to nicotine are shown pictures of people smoking. It lights up with people with pathological gambling when they're shown gambling scenes. And in one of my favorite studies, this is done by a friend who's a food researcher at Yale. She did this for her PhD thesis. And what she did was she put people in a PET scanner so she could feed them chocolate. And she fed them their favorite chocolate and just scanned their brain as they were eating chocolate. And they're like, this is great, I get paid to eat chocolate. And so they started out, and they're like, this is great, I really want another piece. And then she'd keep feeding him, okay, this is good, and then it'd become neutral, and then they'd be like, how long is this experiment going? Did you get approval from your university to do this? And by the end, they're like, I hate science, I'm never doing a science experiment again, because she just keeps feeding him. So they go on from this is awesome to this is terrible. Well, guess which was the only brain region that was activated during the awesome and terrible? It was the posterior cingulate cortex. So this is really, really interesting. And we started wondering, well, how does all of this fit together? Because you can see, I'm just going to not try to stress you out, but look at all the different types of studies that activate the posterior cingulate cortex, right? This is crazy. Like, how do all of these studies converge? So along with some collaborators, we formulated this working hypothesis that this posterior cingulate part of the default mode network, this self-referential brain region, might be involved in getting caught up in our experience, this experiential sense of self rather than a conceptual sense of self. And of course, the task of mindfulness training is to not get caught up, right? So here's this caught up, and mindfulness training might help us not get caught up. And we can test this empirically. I won't go through all the data with this first study, because we published it a couple of years ago, but the first finding that we had was actually a non-finding. We couldn't publish it because our hypothesis was that there would be a brain region that would be activated when we're meditating. At least that's what I thought, because I was working pretty hard when I was meditating. And in fact, we couldn't find a single brain region that was increased in activity in experienced versus novice meditators. And we even collapsed 3 different types of meditations together to see if there was something convergent. But then something else really interesting emerged. We asked the question, well, what about deactivation in the brain? And this is shown here in blue. So experienced meditators show less activity in these main hubs of the default mode network compared to novice meditators. This was really interesting to us, and it was also somewhat different than what had been found previously. So we started asking the question, well, I don't know, are our data actually true? I'd been meditating probably about 10 years at that point, and I was like pretty jazzed on mindfulness research. And so I turned to this guy, Richard Feynman's a Nobel Prize winning physicist, and he reminds all us scientists that we need to be really careful. We can be totally biasing ourselves without even knowing it. So one of my colleagues at Yale had developed this technology where we could actually give real-time feedback as people are meditating, so we can start to bridge this gap between subjective experience and brain activity, right? So we can give people feedback and show them what their brain is doing as they're meditating. We can do a bunch of control experiments, which I won't show you in the interest of time, but basically what this looks like is, well, I'll show you a video of what this looks like. We're now moving this to EEG source estimated localization. But the idea is that we can start to link this subjective experience up directly with brain activity, which is something that's really important to do in cognitive neuroscience, in my opinion. So a lot of this work, I'll just point out, one of my former postdocs, Katie Garrison, and one of my current senior research scientists, Remco van Luderveld, are leading this work. But I'll show you, we were very fortunate to have a news person come in and actually volunteer to do this while he was being filmed. Some of you might recognize him. This is just the next generation of exercise. We've got the physical exercise components down, and now it's about working out how can we actually train our minds.
Dr. Brewer is trying to understand how mindfulness can alter the functioning of the brain. He uses a cap lined with 128 electrodes.
We're going to start filling each of these 128 wells with conduction gel.
The electrodes are able to pick up signals from the posterior cingulate, part of a brain network linked to memory and emotion.
This is all just picking up electrical signal from the top of your head.
Since attending the mindfulness retreat, I've been meditating daily. I was curious to see if it had an impact on my brain.
We're going to have you start with thinking of something that was very anxiety-provoking for you.
Okay. When I thought about something stressful, the cells in my brain's posterior cingulate immediately started firing, shown by the red lines that went off the chart on the computer screen.
Just drop into meditation.
Okay. When I let go of those stressful thoughts and refocused on my breath, within seconds the brain cells that had been firing quieted down, shown by the blue lines on the computer.
That's really fascinating to see like that.
Dr. Brewer believes everyone can train their brains to reach that blue mindfulness zone, And he says all the technology we're surrounded by makes it difficult.
So I'm just going to show you an example of how much rich data we can collect from this. And I'll go through this quickly because we're toward the end of time. But basically, we can have people meditate for 1 minute, and then we can have them report on their experience. And this person said, I caught myself. I was trying to guess when the words were going to end. That was our baseline task. And when the meditation was going to begin. So I was trying to be like, ready, set, go. And then there's this additional word that popped up, and I was like, oh, shit. And there's this red spike. I sort of immediately settled in and was really getting into it. And then I thought, oh my gosh, this is amazing. It's describing exactly what I'm saying. I was like, okay, don't get distracted. And I got back into it and got blue again. I was like, oh my gosh, this is unbelievable. And so he said, you know, I find it really funny because it's the next question. That's a perfect map of what my mind is going through. And so here's some examples of things that people are actually discovering. This person said, I worried I wasn't using the graph as an object, so I tried to look at it harder, and the graph actually went red. Or here's some examples. This person said, toward the middle, I had some thoughts which I don't see on the graph, maybe because I let them flow by. I noticed the more I relaxed and stopped trying to do anything, the bluer it went. Now this was a breakthrough for me because now I could actually understand what the heck Yoda was talking about, right? And in fact, if we think about this contraction versus expansion, there's a guy, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, described this state of flow in psychology, which I think lines up very interestingly with meditation practice because he talks about it being selfless, effortless, timeless. And so if you think of contraction, but you go the opposite direction and you let go and you start to lose that sense of a boundary between this is me and this is the rest of the world and where am I? This starts to trip into the territory of the way he described flow. And we actually had somebody in the scanner trip into flow. We never mentioned the word in the entire experiment. And she's like, well, there's a sense of flow, being with the breath. It deepened in the middle. And we kind of got a snapshot of that. So we can, you know, this might all be well and good from a theoretical or a scientific perspective. But we might be thinking, these are a bunch of experienced meditators. I better start meditating the rest of my life. But we can actually learn something interesting here. It may not be about the quantity of practice. And I think Zindel was talking about this as well. What about the quality of practice? What about the view in terms of seeing clearly how our minds work? And this is where I turn to an American football coach, Vince Lombardi. They actually give out the Lombardi Trophy at the Super Bowl. He was talking about perfect practice. So how does this work? So I think about mindfulness in terms of, what are the ingredients that are needed for a good mindfulness soup? So we're talking about paying attention, but what else? So here's a novice meditator. These are 3-minute runs, right? 3, 6, 9 minutes brain transplant, right? No. What happened after that 9th minute? Well, we can ask him, and he said, well, I felt a lot more relaxed, like it was less of a struggle to prevent my mind from wandering. So not trying to force things. He was actually describing what's classically called the 5th factor of awakening, passaddhi, which may be translated as like tranquility or relaxation. So he was actually tripping into that using the neurofeedback. Here's an experienced meditator who said, was focusing on the breath, in particular the feeling of interest, wonder, and joy. Look at this brain activity. So he was describing these two, the 2nd and 4th factors of awakening. So curiosity or interest, and piti or joy, sometimes translated as joy or rapture. Here's a novice meditator who said, I was thinking about my breath. I don't think your feedback works. But in the very next round, he said, oh, physical sensation instead of thinking in and out. So we can think of this as like, getting out of our own way. So just to wrap this up, can we actually start to hack this system where, this trigger might be a negative emotion, for example, and then we fall into any one of our myriad habitual behaviors for that temporary relief? But what if we actually replace that behavior, that external behavior where we need to get something or do something, with something that is always available? What about curiosity or this curious interest? So here we can turn to Lewis Carroll. Alice in Wonderland said, curiouser and curiouser. So what does curiosity actually feel like? Like if we have a craving, we get contracted around that, I gotta fix this. Well, what if we get curious about that craving? What does curiosity itself feel like? Does it feel ugh. Does it feel better than the craving itself? Can we actually start to tap into this reward-based learning system and help our brain see, oh, how does curiosity feel compared to craving? And in this sense, we might even be able to tap into this very old process that works very, very well to help us change behavior. So I'll just finish with a couple of quotes of people actually describing this. Here's somebody from our anxiety program. She said, when I first started the program, I didn't quite buy into the benefits of curiosity. Today, I felt a wave of panic, and instead of immediate dread or fear, my automatic response was, that's interesting. That took the wind right out of its sails. I wasn't just saying it was interesting, I actually felt it. So really embodying that. Or as this person put it, what's most interesting to me is how we define the rewards. In the past, the reward of eating right had been weight loss, but it was more often than not short-lived because I hadn't made real process changes in my daily life. Here it feels like the reward is defined differently, and weight loss is a side effect. The reward here is, for a lack of better expression, a more balanced life or inner peace. So just to bring it back to the patient that I mentioned, she went through our pilot testing of our mindfulness program. She lost about 40 pounds, but most importantly, she said, I actually feel like I have my life back because I can eat a single piece of pizza and actually enjoy it. So as we start to let go of these old, previous, habitual notions of self, who I am, we can start to ask the question, as Alice put it, who in the world am I? That's the great puzzle. So I want to thank all of the folks that contributed to this work, including our funders, and thank you for listening.